Teach me how to kiss a guy. Evan Brooks stared at Jake Turner from across his bedroom, convinced for one ridiculous second that exhaustion had finally broken his ability to understand English. The digital clock beside his bed read 1:17 in the morning. Rain tapped against the windows of their Chicago apartment, and Jake stood in the doorway wearing a faded gray college t-shirt and sweatpants, looking far too serious for someone who had just detonated a perfectly normal Thursday night. "I am sorry," Evan said. "What?" Jake shifted his weight. "You heard me. I definitely heard something. I am giving you an opportunity to replace it with a sentence that makes sense." Normally, Jake would have laughed. Tonight, he did not. Evan slowly sat upright. They had been roommates for almost 2 years, which meant Evan knew Jake's habits better than he probably should. He knew Jake needed 2 alarms before getting out of bed, bought the same terrible cereal every week, and could somehow spend 20 minutes looking for keys that were usually in his jacket pocket. Evan also knew Jake dated women. That particular fact mattered more than all the others. Jake had broken up with his girlfriend, Lauren, 3 weeks earlier after nearly 8 months together. Evan had assumed the late-night question would be about her. Clearly, he had assumed wrong. "Why are you asking me?" Evan said. Jake stepped into the room, but remained several feet from the bed. "Because I trust you. That explains why you were talking to me. It does not explain what you just asked." Jake looked toward the rain-covered window. "Have you ever believed something about yourself because you never had a reason to question it?" Evan's humor faded. "We are not talking about kissing anymore, are we? Maybe we are talking about both." Evan studied him. Jake's usual confidence had disappeared. "You know there is no test for this, right? Nobody hands you a checklist." "I know. And kissing somebody is not going to magically explain who you are." "I know that too." Evan folded his arms. "Then what exactly do you want from me?" Jake was silent for several seconds. "I want to know how you knew." Evan understood. "Immediately. That I liked men?" Jake nodded. Evan considered the question. "I think I spent more time learning to stop arguing with myself than actually figuring it out. Eventually, the truth was just simpler." Jake looked down. "What if the truth changes? Maybe it does not change. Maybe your understanding of it does." Jake looked back at him, and something in his expression made Evan's heartbeat stumble. This was dangerous territory, especially because Evan had spent more than a year carefully keeping his own feelings invisible. Jake was his best friend. Jake was straight. Those 2 facts had always been the walls protecting their friendship. Now one of those walls suddenly had a crack in it. Evan took a slow breath. "Is there someone?" Jake became completely still. "What? A guy? You did not walk into my room after 1 in the morning because of a philosophical question. Is there someone you are thinking about?" Jake did not answer. Evan forced himself to ask the question he was already afraid to hear answered. "Who do you want to kiss?" The rain filled the silence. Jake's eyes dropped briefly toward Evan's mouth before rising to meet his gaze again. He said nothing, but for the first time in 2 years, Evan wondered whether silence could be an answer. Jake finally looked away, and somehow that unsettled Evan more than any answer could have. "Forget I asked," Jake said quietly. "That is going to be difficult." Jake gave him a tired half-smile, then disappeared into the hallway. Evan remained awake long after Jake's bedroom door closed. By morning, the apartment looked painfully normal. Jake was already in the kitchen making coffee when Evan walked in, and without asking, he pushed Evan's usual mug across the counter with exactly the right amount of cream. "Morning," Jake said. "That depends on whether we are pretending last night never happened." Jake stared into his coffee. "Can we postpone that conversation until I have functioning brain cells?" Evan almost pushed him, but he stopped. Jake had trusted him enough to ask something frightening. Evan could give him time. The problem was that time gave Evan room to remember everything he had spent months trying to dismiss. Their apartment had always been full of little routines that felt dangerously close to belonging together. Friday nights meant pizza from the place 3 blocks away, and whichever terrible movie Jake insisted had good reviews. Sunday mornings meant grocery shopping, where Jake filled the cart with sugary cereal while Evan quietly replaced half of it with actual food. When Evan worked late on illustration projects, Jake left dinner in the refrigerator and texted reminders that coffee was not a food group. When Jake had a bad day at work, he usually ended up on the couch beside Evan, talking until midnight. Then there was the navy hoodie. Jake had borrowed it during a cold evening almost a year earlier and apparently decided ownership was now a philosophical concept. Evan complained every time he saw Jake wearing it. Secretly, he liked it far too much. The moment Evan finally admitted he was in trouble had happened 6 months earlier. He had been working on a difficult client project at the kitchen table when Jake returned from the gym carrying 2 coffees. Jake placed one beside Evan without interrupting him. Evan took a sip and realized it was exactly right. "How do you remember my order?" he had asked. Jake shrugged. "I remember things about people I care about." He walked away as if the sentence meant nothing. Evan sat there staring at the coffee for nearly a minute. That afternoon, he created a rule for himself. Do not fall in love with the straight roommate. It would have been excellent advice if he had invented it sooner. Jake had Lauren then. She was smart, friendly, and genuinely good to him. Evan never allowed himself to resent her because she had done nothing wrong. His feelings were his responsibility, not hers, and certainly not Jake's. So Evan learned to translate everything into friendship. Jake falling asleep against his shoulder during movies was friendship. Jake remembering his deadlines was friendship. Jake texting when Evan stayed out late was friendship. It had to be. Now Evan sat across from him at breakfast, remembering the way Jake had looked at his mouth. Jake caught him staring. "What? Nothing. That is obviously not true." Evan lifted his coffee. "I am practicing patience." Jake smiled faintly. "That sounds difficult for you." "Extremely." Jake stood, picked up his gym bag, and headed toward the hallway. Before leaving, he stopped. "Evan." "Yeah." Jake looked back at him. "I did not ask you last night just because you were gay." Evan's fingers tightened around the mug. "Then why me?" Jake held his gaze for one long second. "Because when I imagine being honest about this, you are the only person I want in the room." Then he left, and Evan realized the rule he had spent 6 months protecting suddenly felt far more fragile than the feelings it was supposed to contain. For the next 3 days, Jake said nothing more about that night. But somehow his questions became even harder for Evan to ignore. On Monday evening, Evan was working at the kitchen table when Jake opened the refrigerator and casually asked, "Do you think someone can realize who they like later than everyone expects?" Evan stopped moving his stylus across the drawing tablet. "That depends on what you mean by later." Jake took out a bottle of water. "Mid-20s. That is not late." "So it happens." "Of course it happens. People understand themselves at different times." Jake nodded as if storing the answer somewhere important, then changed the subject. Tuesday brought another question. They were eating takeout on the couch when Jake asked, "Would you ever date a guy who had only dated women?" Evan slowly lowered his fork. "You have become extremely interested in hypothetical men." "I am asking generally." "Generally, yes. If he actually knew he wanted to date me." Jake looked toward the television. What if he was still figuring things out? Evan considered his answer carefully. Questioning yourself is not a problem. Making somebody else responsible for answering the question can be. Jake became quiet. Meaning I would not want to be somebody's experiment. Evan softened his voice. That does not mean the person is doing anything wrong by being uncertain. I would just need honesty. Jake nodded. That makes sense. Wednesday evening, Evan was searching the refrigerator for dinner when Jake leaned against the counter and asked the question Evan had been expecting without wanting to admit it. What is your type? Evan looked over his shoulder. My type? In men. You are conducting a very strange survey. Jake smiled. Humor me. Evan closed the refrigerator. Funny. Kind. Emotionally available. That sounds suspiciously reasonable. I have standards. Tall. Not required. Athletic. Optional. Brown hair. Evan narrowed his eyes. Are you building a police sketch? Jake laughed. I am curious. Evan decided to test him. Actually, you would be completely wrong for me. Jake's smile faltered. Me? You asked. I did not ask if I was your type. You were clearly getting there. Jake folded his arms. Fine. Why would I be wrong for you? Evan counted dramatically on his fingers. You steal my hoodie. You buy cereal designed for 8-year-olds. You refuse to admit that your favorite action movie is terrible. You leave cabinet doors open. Those are character flaws, not dating criteria. Serious character flaws. Jake laughed, but his eyes remained fixed on Evan. So definitely not your type? Something in his voice had changed. Evan felt it immediately. Why does that matter? Jake looked down for half a second. It does not. Evan had known Jake long enough to recognize a lie delivered badly. Right. He opened the refrigerator again, pretending to search for something he no longer remembered wanting. Behind him, Jake remained silent. Then he said, Are you seeing anyone? Evan turned back. Not currently. Jake's shoulders relaxed so subtly that anyone else might have missed it. Evan did not. Good to know, Jake said. Why is that good to know? Jake picked up his water and started toward the hallway. No reason. Jake. He stopped and glanced back. Evan held his gaze. You keep asking questions like the answers matter to you. Jake's expression became unreadable. Maybe they do. Then he walked away, leaving Evan alone in the kitchen with the growing suspicion that Jake was no longer trying to understand some hypothetical version of himself. By Friday evening, Evan had reached the limit of how many meaningful questions Jake could ask, while pretending none of the answers mattered. They were halfway through their usual movie when Jake paused it without warning and set the remote on the coffee table. I want to finish our conversation. Evan looked at him. Which one? You have started about 6 this week. Jake ignored the joke. The one from your room. Evan's heartbeat immediately changed. I thought you wanted me to forget that. I changed my mind. Jake shifted toward him on the couch. You said there was no secret to kissing someone. There is not. Then what matters? Evan studied him before answering. Trust. Paying attention. Not assuming anything. Jake nodded. And if you want to get closer? You make sure the other person is comfortable. How? Sometimes you ask. Evan paused. Sometimes you move slowly enough to give them every chance to say no. Jake looked at the space between them. Like this. He moved a little closer. Evan's pulse quickened. Jake, you can tell me to stop. Evan should have. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was. Jake moved his hand across the couch cushion until it rested a few inches from Evan's. Is this okay? Evan nodded. Yes. Jake's expression softened. Then what? Eye contact helps. Jake looked directly into his eyes. Evan immediately regretted the suggestion. You are taking that very seriously. I am trying to learn. You are making it difficult to think. A nervous smile appeared on Jake's face. Maybe that is mutual. The humor disappeared from Evan's expression. Jake was close enough now that the familiar details of his face suddenly felt different. Evan could see uncertainty behind the confidence, but he could also see intention. Jake moved slightly closer, slowly and carefully. Evan did not retreat. For several suspended seconds, neither man spoke. The movie remained frozen on the television while city lights glowed beyond the apartment windows. Jake's eyes briefly dropped toward Evan's mouth, then returned to his gaze. Evan, he said quietly. Evan knew what was about to happen, and the realization frightened him because he wanted it far too much. Then Jake's phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen illuminated between them. Lauren. Evan's entire body went still. Jake glanced at the name and immediately looked back at him. It is not what you think. Evan moved away and stood. You have no idea what I think. Lauren called me earlier this week too. We are sorting out some things from the breakup. That is exactly my point. Jake stood. What point? Evan turned toward him. 3 weeks ago, you were ending an 8-month relationship with a woman. Now you are sitting on our couch asking me how to kiss a man while your former girlfriend is calling you at night. I'm not trying to get back together with her. Maybe not. But you are still figuring out what you want. Jake's frustration faded into something more vulnerable. What if I already know? Evan felt hope rise and immediately refused to trust it. Then say it. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came. The phone vibrated again. Evan nodded slowly, more disappointed than angry. That is what I thought. Evan, wait. Evan stepped toward the hallway. Jake did not follow. Figure out what you want before you ask me again, Evan said. He walked into his bedroom and closed the door gently behind him. On the other side, the apartment remained silent. Evan leaned against the door, realizing the hardest part was not that Jake might still be confused. It was that for one brief moment on the couch, Evan had been completely certain Jake was about to choose him. For the next week, Evan stopped waiting for Jake to finish a sentence he seemed unable to complete. It was not punishment, and Evan was not angry. He was simply tired of building hope from pauses, glances, and questions that never became answers. On Monday afternoon, he took his laptop to the coffee shop where he sometimes worked on illustration projects. He had been comparing 2 versions of a book cover for nearly 15 minutes when a voice from the next table said, "The one on the left." Evan looked over. A man around his age was sitting beside a camera bag with photographs open across his laptop screen. "I am sorry," Evan asked. The stranger smiled. "You keep switching between those designs. The one on the left has better balance." Evan glanced at his screen. "You." Realize unsolicited design criticism usually costs at least one coffee. That seems fair. His name was Caleb Moore, a freelance photographer who had recently moved to Chicago. One coffee became an hour of conversation, and when Caleb asked whether Evan wanted to get dinner Saturday, there was no hesitation hidden inside the invitation. Yes, Evan said. Saturday evening, Evan was checking his reflection in the hallway mirror when Jake walked out of his bedroom wearing Evan's navy hoodie. He stopped when he saw Evan's dark green shirt and jacket. "You are going somewhere?" "Dinner." Jake leaned against the wall. "With someone?" Evan met his eyes in the mirror. "That is generally how dinner plans work." "Who?" "Caleb." Jake's expression changed almost too quickly to notice. "Coffee shop guy." Evan turned around. "I mentioned him once. I remember things." The words hit Evan because Jake had said something almost identical months earlier. Evan picked up his keys. "Do not wait up." "I was not planning to." Evan returned shortly after 11 and found Jake sitting on the couch with the television on and his phone untouched beside him. "Good movie?" Evan asked. Jake looked at the screen as if he had forgotten it existed. "It is fine. You have no idea what is happening, do you?" "Not really." Evan smiled and started toward the kitchen. Jake spoke before he reached it. "How was dinner?" "Good. Just good." Evan turned. "Really good." Jake nodded slowly. "Are you seeing him again?" "Thursday." "Already?" Evan stared at him. "Is there a mandatory waiting period I missed?" "No. I was just asking. You do that a lot lately." Jake looked away. Over the next several days, Caleb texted Evan regularly, and Jake noticed every time. Wednesday morning, Evan smiled at his phone over coffee. Jake immediately asked, "Caleb?" Evan set the phone down. "Do you want me to add you to the conversation?" "No." "Then why do you care?" Jake carried his mug toward the sink. "I do not." Evan watched him for a moment. "You know what I like about Caleb?" Jake's shoulders tightened. "What?" "I never have to wonder what he means." Jake turned around. Evan continued before he could respond. "He asked me out because he wanted to take me out. He texts because he wants to talk to me. There is no puzzle." Jake's expression became quieter. "And that is what you want." "I want someone who knows why he is standing in front of me." The words landed between them. Jake looked as if he wanted to answer, but Evan had heard enough unfinished answers. He picked up his laptop and headed toward the door. Behind him, Jake finally said, "What if somebody is trying to get there?" Evan stopped, but did not turn around. Then he should figure it out before someone else gets there first. Thursday night was supposed to make things simpler. Evan had dinner with Caleb at a small neighborhood restaurant, and for nearly 2 hours, he managed to enjoy himself without wondering what Jake was doing back at the apartment. Caleb was funny, thoughtful, and easy to be around. When they reached Evan's building shortly after 10, Caleb smiled and said, "I had a good time." "So did I." "Would Saturday be too soon?" Evan laughed. "Apparently you do not believe in waiting periods. Life is complicated enough without inventing extra rules." Evan liked that answer more than he expected. Caleb walked upstairs with him because Evan had promised to show him the finished book cover they had argued about when they first met. Inside the apartment, Jake was sitting on the couch with a basketball game playing quietly on television. "Hey," Evan said. Jake looked up, and his expression changed when he noticed Caleb. "Hey." Evan introduced them properly. Caleb was friendly, Jake was polite, and nothing about the conversation should have felt uncomfortable. Yet Evan could sense Jake noticing everything. Caleb sat beside Evan at the kitchen table while Evan opened the illustration on his laptop. They talked about the colors, typography, and the client's final changes. From the living room, Jake changed the television channel twice. 20 minutes later, Caleb stood to leave. Evan walked him to the door. "Saturday?" Caleb asked. "Saturday." Caleb smiled and gave Evan a brief kiss on the cheek before stepping into the hallway. "Good night." "Good night." Evan closed the door and turned around. Jake was standing beside the couch. "Do you actually like him?" Evan stared at him. "Seriously? It is a question. It is none of your business." Jake looked frustrated. "You have gone out with him twice. And now he is coming up here." Evan folded his arms. "You are acting jealous." "Maybe I am." The answer came so quickly that Evan lost his prepared response. "Then tell me why." Jake looked toward the window. "Because every time his name appears on your phone, you smile. Because you leave this apartment excited to see him. Because tonight he sat at our kitchen table like he belonged there. He was here for 20 minutes. That was enough." Evan shook his head. You do not get to be angry because someone else is willing to be clear with me. I am not angry at you. Then what are you? Jake took a breath. Scared. Evan's expression softened despite himself. Of what? That I waited too long. The apartment became quiet except for the television. Evan held Jake's gaze. Caleb knows he likes men. He knows he likes me. I do not have to translate every sentence he says. Jake stepped closer but stopped several feet away. What if I know exactly who I like? Evan's heartbeat jumped. Knowing who and understanding why are different things. I know. Then say it clearly. Jake looked at him with an openness Evan had never seen before. When Caleb looks at you, I wish you were looking at me. Evan did not move. Jake continued. When he texts you, I wish I were the reason you smiled. When you leave to see him, I spend the whole night wondering whether I already missed my chance. Evan swallowed. Jake, I thought I was jealous because everything was changing. Jake shook his head. I was wrong. I am jealous because he gets to do what I have been too afraid to do. Evan's voice dropped. Which is? Jake took one careful step closer. Choose you. For once, he did not look away. So if you want the truth, here it is. I do not care that Caleb is dating a man. I care that the man he is dating is you. Evan had imagined hearing Jake say something like that more times than he wanted to admit, but in every imaginary version, the answer had made everything simple. Standing in their quiet apartment now, Evan realized the truth was more complicated. How long? He asked. Jake looked at him. How long what? How long have you wanted to choose me? Jake let out a nervous breath and sat at the kitchen table. I do not know exactly. Evan remained standing. Try. Jake looked down at his hands. Remember when you got sick last winter? Evan nodded. He had spent 3 miserable days buried under blankets while Jake brought him soup, medicine, and enough orange juice to supply a small restaurant. You had a date that Friday, Evan said. Lauren mentioned it later. I canceled it. Evan frowned. You told me she canceled. I lied. Jake gave an embarrassed smile. I told myself you were sick and I was being a good roommate. But I remember sitting on the couch that night while you slept and realizing I was happier being there than I would have been anywhere else. Evan slowly pulled out the chair across from him. That does not necessarily mean what you think it means. I know. That is what I kept telling myself. Jake looked up. Then there was your birthday. Evan remembered the crowded apartment, the pizza boxes, the music, and the friends who stayed too late. After everyone left, we talked in the kitchen until almost 3 in the morning. Jake continued. You fell asleep at the table. Evan smiled faintly. That sounds dignified. You were exhausted. Jake smiled too, then became serious again. I put a blanket around you, and I remember thinking that the apartment felt right because you were in it. Evan's chest tightened. Jake, there were other things. I noticed when you worked late. I noticed when you went out with friends. I started saving stupid stories during the day because I wanted to tell you first. Jake paused. Lauren noticed before I did. Evan's expression changed. She knew? Not exactly. But a few weeks before we broke up, she asked why I talked about you so much. Jake rubbed his palms together. She knew your coffee order because I mentioned it. She knew about your clients. She knew you hated my cereal. She finally asked whether I was building a life with her because it was what I wanted or because it was the life I had always assumed I would have. Evan was silent. What did you tell her? I did not have a good answer. Jake looked toward the living room. That was when I started realizing the problem was not Lauren. She was great. The problem was that whenever I imagined the person I wanted to come home and talk to, it was not her. Evan barely breathed. It was me. Jake met his eyes. It was you. The certainty in his voice made the room feel suddenly smaller. Evan remembered Jake standing in his bedroom at 1:17 in the morning. So when you asked me that question, you already knew there was someone. Yes. You knew it was me. Jake hesitated only for a second. Yes. Evan stared at him. Then why did you make it sound like some experiment? Because asking you to teach me was less terrifying than telling my best friend I wanted to kiss him. Jake leaned forward slightly, keeping the table between them. I thought I needed to understand what wanting you said about me before I could admit that I wanted you at all. Evan's voice softened. And now? Jake took a slow breath. Now I think I was asking the wrong question. Evan waited. Jake held his gaze. I kept asking myself what liking you makes me. What I should have been asking is whether there is any chance you have been trying not to like me too. Evan had spent more than a year preparing himself to never answer that question honestly. Now Jake was sitting across from him, waiting and every excuse Evan had used to protect himself suddenly felt useless. Yes, Evan said. Jake blinked. Yes. Yes. I have been trying not to like you. Evan gave a quiet, nervous laugh. Actually, that is not completely accurate. I have been trying not to love you. Jake went still. Evan looked down at the table because seeing hope appear on Jake's face made the next words harder. But I cannot do this tonight. The hope immediately became confusion. Why? Because loving you does not erase everything we just talked about. Jake leaned back slightly. You think I am still confused. I think you are finally being honest, and those are not necessarily the same thing. Evan met his eyes. A week ago, you were asking me questions like I had some answer key. Tonight, you are telling me you have wanted me for months. That matters to me more than you understand, but I cannot become the way you prove something to yourself. You are not an experiment. Then do not treat yourself like one either. Jake became quiet. Evan continued carefully. You do not need to decide on a label tonight. You do not owe me one. But you need to know that whatever happens between us is something you chose because you wanted it, not because you were scared, jealous, lonely after Lauren, or afraid Caleb might take your chance away. Jake looked toward the dark apartment window. What if I already know that? Then knowing it tomorrow will not hurt. Jake looked back at him. The frustration Evan expected never came. Instead, Jake nodded slowly. That is fair. Evan almost wished he would argue. It would have been easier than watching him understand. Jake stood and walked toward his bedroom. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a small duffel bag. Evan immediately straightened. What are you doing? My brother lives about 20 minutes away. He has a guest room. Jake, I did not ask you to leave. I know. Jake put the bag beside the door. I am not moving out. I just think you are right about one thing. I need to hear my own thoughts without looking at you every 5 seconds and wanting the easiest answer. Evan folded his arms. That is almost flattering. It was completely flattering. Jake smiled, but his eyes remained serious. He slipped his apartment key into his pocket. The next time I ask you for something, I want you to know I am asking because I chose it. Evan swallowed. Okay. Jake opened the door, then paused. For what it is worth, Caleb did not make me want you. Evan said nothing. He just made me realize someone else might get the life with you that I had already started imagining. Then Jake left. The apartment became painfully quiet. Over the next 4 days, Evan discovered how much of home sounded like Jake. There was no music from the shower, no cabinet door left open after breakfast, no terrible cereal box appearing on the counter, no voice calling from the living room to ask whether Evan wanted pizza. Caleb texted about Saturday, and Evan stared at the message for several minutes before answering that he needed some time because his feelings were more complicated than he had admitted. Caleb responded kindly, without pressure. On the 4th night, Evan stood alone in the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs before realizing he only needed one. He stared at the second mug in his hand and understood the strange reversal. For more than a year, Evan had been waiting for Jake to choose him. Now, because he loved him, Evan needed Jake to choose himself first. Jake came home on the 5th evening at 7:12, and Evan knew it was him before the apartment door fully opened. The familiar sound of Jake's key turning in the lock stopped Evan halfway through making dinner. Jake stepped inside carrying the same duffel bag, closed the door, and looked across the room at Evan as if 4 days had somehow made the distance between them much larger than 20 feet. Hey, Jake said. Hey. Evan set down the wooden spoon. Jake placed his bag beside the couch. I missed home. Evan tried to smile. Your cereal survived. I was not talking about the cereal. Evan's smile disappeared. Jake took a slow breath. I talked to my brother. I told him about Lauren, the questions, Caleb, and you. Mostly you. Evan waited. He asked me what I was actually trying to figure out. I told him I thought I needed to know what liking you meant about me. Jake shook his head. Then he asked a much simpler question. If nobody else got to define me, would I still want to come home and tell you how I feel? Evan's chest tightened. What did you say? Yes. Jake stepped farther into the apartment, but kept several feet between them. I still do not have a perfect label, Evan. Maybe someday I will. Maybe understanding myself will take time. But I realized I was using that uncertainty as an excuse to avoid the one thing I already knew, which is, I love you. Evan went completely still. Jake continued before fear could interrupt him. Not because Caleb showed up. Not because Lauren and I broke up. Not because I am lonely. I love the person Who remembers which cereal I hate, even while insulting the cereal I actually buy? I love the guy who works too late and pretends coffee counts as dinner. I love that you challenge me when I am hiding behind an easy answer. I missed you every day I was gone, but missing you was not what convinced me. Being away just made it impossible to confuse habit with choice. Evan looked down, overwhelmed by how ordinary and enormous the moment felt at the same time. You really thought about this? Jake smiled nervously. My brother probably never wants another 4-hour conversation with me. Evan laughed, and some of the tension finally left the room. Jake moved one step closer. The first night I came into your room, I asked you to teach me something because I was terrified of saying what I actually wanted. Evan remembered the rain against the windows and the glowing clock reading 1:17. I remember. I do not want a lesson anymore. Jake stopped, leaving enough space for Evan to decide what happened next. Evan, can I kiss you? Evan felt his eyes sting with relieved laughter. You do not need a lesson. Jake smiled. That was not an answer. Evan stepped closer. Yes. Their kiss was brief, gentle, and almost surprisingly simple. When they moved apart, Jake laughed softly. I spent 4 days preparing for that. You over-prepared. I usually do. 3 months later, their apartment still looked almost exactly the same. Friday nights still meant pizza and terrible movies. Jake still stole Evan's navy hoodie. Evan still moved Jake's cereal to the highest cabinet whenever he got annoyed. The difference appeared in smaller things. Jake reached for Evan's hand without hesitation. Evan no longer had to translate kindness into friendship just to protect himself. One Sunday morning, they sat together at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee while Chicago moved beyond the windows. Jake leaned against Evan's shoulder. Do you ever miss when we were just roommates? Evan pretended to consider it. You were easier to ignore. Jake laughed. You were terrible at ignoring me. Evan looked at their 2 mugs sitting side by side and smiled. Jake had entered his room asking for instructions because he was afraid of the truth. In the end, neither of them had needed instructions. Jake had needed the courage to choose honestly, and Evan had needed the courage to wait until that choice truly belonged to him.